So after popular requests on my community tab and a poll I put on there, I finally started my podcast, and this is the first episode. And to join me today is my long-term girlfriend, Holly, and she's also a writer at NME, which if you're in England, you know is quite a prominent music magazine, and she's done a lot of things in film. She's interviewed a lot of famous people, so probably the most famous, or people you would know, is Rosamund Pike, who plays the wife in Gone Girl, you know, the film with Ben Affleck by David Fincher. And yeah, Holly's is here today to help me talk about films, and we've both got some lists. I'm going to go through them and really give our opinion on sort of these films and TV shows we really like, and we're going to ask each other questions about them. So to get into the first one, we'll start with Holly. So Holly has chosen as her first film her favourite film, which is Danny Boyle's The Beach. So Holly has a poster up there because we're in her room right now. So Holly, why don't you tell me about the premise of the film and tell the audience about the premise, because not all of us have seen The Beach. So
yeah, so The Beach is basically it's a book by Alex Garland, and it's a Danny Boyle film. There's a guy called Richard who goes travelling in Thailand, and he is basically looking for something different. He meets a guy called Daffy who leaves him a map of an island, and it's basically this secluded beach, which it's kind of like this mythical place that has this community of travellers living there, but he follows the map and he finds it, and it's real, and it's basically about his experience on the beach.
Okay, so why don't you tell me and tell the audience, so why do you like this film so much? Why is it one of your favourite films of all time? And why don't you tell us about how it's inspired your own personal life and what you've done in the last couple of years?
It's my favourite film. It's kind of the film that made Danny Boyle my favourite director, and Leonardo DiCaprio is one of my favourite actors as well. I like it so much because it spoke to me in terms of the messages it has in it about travelling and about sort of like ideas of paradise and finding something different and like relationships with people. And it's not the best film I've ever seen, and to this day I don't think it's the best film that exists, but it's my favourite film, and it has been my favourite film for many years, since I was maybe 17. And in terms of how it's influenced me, I went travelling last year, and sadly it closed the very month that I went there.
Yeah, from like litter and things like that.
I've been waiting to go there my whole life, and it literally closed the month that I went to Thailand, which was really, really unfortunate. But yeah, it's basically closed because of the tourism there, because of the film. It's completely destroyed the marine life. There's tons of litter. There's the nearby islands in PP which is a Thai island, won't let you bring plastic onto the island just because of the amount of pollution from tourism.
So it's kind of ironic that a film about a secluded, isolated beach has now been closed because so many people have gone to it. Yeah,
exactly. And it's kind of famous even amongst people who haven't seen it. I wanted to go so badly because of how much the film means to me, but you know, you go to PP, which is the nearest island, and there's boat trips everywhere advertising that you can go there. And you know, you can stay overnight on the beach and things like that, but it was meant to be closed until September or something last year, but now it's basically closed indefinitely until everything's recovered. Which it's good. I was sad, but it's good. It needs that, I suppose.
So out of all the films that we've got on our list, this is the one that we've both seen, but I'm not going to really give my own opinion, but what do you think in general this film's message is, or what is it really trying to say, if anything, or is its purpose really just to be a good film? Is it not really about anything?
Yeah, so I'll ask you what you think in a minute, because I know you think something slightly different to what I think. From watching it, the main thing that I take away from it is sort of ideas about trying to find paradise, and people who... So Richard talks about like the pursuit of pleasure as his lifestyle in it, and it's just this community of people who are just living, you know, they're working together, they're fishing, and they're just, you know, they're playing volleyball, they're playing cricket, and they're just having a good time. And it's about kind of how sustainable that is, and if it's realistic, if that's the kind of, if you can make paradise something that lasts forever. And then Richard kind of finds out, you know, one of the final moments in the film was he talks about paradise not being somewhere you can go, but it's how you feel when you're a part of something. And I think that's really powerful. But like, you obviously have seen it
I've seen
it, but like
maybe twice.
Yeah, but you don't have the same kind of personal connection to it that I do. So like, what do you think the messages of it are, just from watching it like once or twice?
Well, the message is quite clearly like these people are bored with their lives and they want an escape. But I think we spoke about before, just their utopia is quite surface level. It's all about having a good time, having fun. And when, like I think you were saying another time, is when something bad happens, they just act like nothing is going wrong. And rather than the utopia, you sometimes think about maybe communism or something. Rather than that, it's more like a utopia just for feeling good. And it's kind of born out of this era, the 1990s, where the book was written, and the early 2000s. It's just, I guess, where everything is becoming so similar because we're all connected and everything's becoming so... I don't know what the word is, like the value of traveling to these places, it's just become just like where we've come from, because everyone likes the comforts of home.
Yeah.
Where the people in the film are sort of more adventurous, but they're looking for this experience that kind of doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah.
And they're a generation, especially Richard, who's you know, he must have been born, his character, if he's mid-20s, born in the 70s. And you know, the first generation that haven't been born in America, especially in terms of the film, without a war to fight. Because the Vietnam War's over, and there's lots of stuff talking about Vietnam. It's kind of like Richard's own Vietnam, going to a country on the border. It looks very like Vietnam, and then in the film he's fighting with people who look like Viet Cong, essentially, because they are drug dealers with AK-47s and the little farmers' hats, and he's running through the fields acting like he himself is a Viet Cong. It's just an interesting thing. It just seems like it's a generation that has nothing to fight for, and it's so comfortable. They kind of try and make in their own war in a way. So I thought it was quite interesting. It's more in stuff around the book and how the book was written and what time period, but I think it translated in the film pretty well. Yeah,
there's definitely a lot more in the book that kind of lends itself to that sort of interpretation.
Yeah.
But yeah, what you were saying, like, about, you know, looking for an experience that doesn't really exist anymore. At the beginning of the film, Richard says, you know, we travel thousands of miles to sit in our hotel rooms and watch TV, and, you know, somewhere with all the comforts at home. What's the point of that? And it's got a timelessness to it, because everyone is always looking for something different. I suppose if you're like a proper traveller, you know, you want something beyond the tourist experience. And that doesn't really exist anymore, especially when you go to PP, where it's set, or it was filmed, I think, on the other side of Thailand near like Koh Phangan. And yeah, like, it's everywhere is touristy, and it's just kind of like, even back in the 90s when it was filmed, even then it just doesn't really exist. And like, Richard is, you know, he's talking about parasites eating up the whole world when he's kind of looking, I think it's meant to be like a full moon party that happens on Koh Phangan, and he's just seeing people like destroying the beach and like getting sick and partying, and he's just kind of disgusted at the behaviour. And like you were saying about them just trying to have a good time, there's the bit where one of the guys gets attacked by a shark and they leave him in the woods because they say, you know, if you ignore it, it will go away, basically. They don't want anything to ruin their good time. They're literally willing to let this guy rot, who is a member of their community. Yeah, probably, I think I'm straying off a little bit from what you were saying, but
that's all good stuff. So in terms of the beach, I guess that's enough to talk about, but just an interesting point is that although people were saying it couldn't exist back then, it's kind of, like you're saying, timeless, in the sense that a lot of people have like timers on their, you know, phone to tell them when to stop using social media and disconnect, and maybe somewhere like the beach where none of that exists is quite appealing to a lot of people these days in a world where we're so connected.
Okay, so the next film we're going to talk about is a film that Connor saw this year, Vice.
Yeah.
So obviously a very political film.
Yeah. So
tell us what it's about.
So Vice is obviously about Vice President Dick Cheney and about his life, and it's directed by Adam McKay, who did the Anchorman films, and he wrote for SNL, and he also did The Big Short, which is a very good film that I think we both like. But yeah, the premise is you look through Dick Cheney's life and his rise through politics, but it's not in a chronological order, but it does go between a lot of different periods, and it's an interesting dynamic which McKay normally uses, is that he blends comedy with real politics, and he tries to outrage you while making you laugh at the same time. So that's a general premise, and it takes place between the 1960s and to about 2007, but 9/11 and the George Bush presidency is a real focal point of the film, really.
So what do you like about the film?
So there's a lot to like about the film. I don't particularly like it as much as The Big Short, but the performances are really good. Christian Bale is insanely good in it. You can't really imagine that this is him. You just think it is Dick Cheney. It's such a good performance. And I made a joke on Twitter that it's American Psycho 2, because Dick Cheney is totally like insane, really. Well, he's not, but he's like a super villain, really. And then you got other good performances. You got I think it's his wife, played by Amy Adams. You have Steve Carell playing Donald Rumsfeld, which is really interesting, and it's a pretty interesting performance as well, because it is funny, but it's quite sinister as well, and it kind of plays on this, how these all guys are really kind of fools in a way. And you have other people like, which is quite famous now, Sam Rockwell playing George Bush, which seems like quite a good casting. And he's not in it too much, but he does give a really good performance, and it kind of shows you how out of touch Bush was, and how it was kind of essentially forced on him in a way, because he never really wanted to be president, it seems like, from this film. It's just because he has quite a big legacy to live up to, with his dad being vice president and being president as well.
What do you think was a better portrayal, Bush or Cheney?
Oh, Christian Bale is way better than Sam Rockwell in this role. It literally, I can't believe Rami Malek, as much as I like him, beat Christian Bale for this, because it's insane. The transformation for I think he's 45 to look about 70, and an overweight, ugly old man, and the voice is really good and everything. In terms of stylistic choices, I like, there's a lot of montages. There's some interesting scenes like Dick and his wife in bed start talking about, they start talking in Shakespearean language, and it sort of seems like Macbeth, because she is this Lady Macbeth figure, really pushing him on, because in the 60s he's a drunk and he's out of control, and she basically says, I'm going to leave you if you don't make a name for yourself, because she's saying, I can't make a name for myself because I'm a woman, so you need to do it for both of us. And that sort of is the kick he needs, and she's sort of the driving force behind him, and she's really, really ruthless. And it's just interesting to see that dynamic of two people who are so driven on controlling everything, and how it's interesting to see how Dick Cheney makes the vice presidency so important when it's irrelevant for most vice presidents. And in terms of liking it, I'll leave on one more point. There's a lot of stuff that makes you pretty outraged in the film and reminds you why you're so angry about it. So if you check my page, I made a video a couple of weeks ago just talking about the Iraq War, and that is trying to do a similar effect to Vice, just make people angry about this event. But it reminded me how angry I was, and it just reminds everyone how much this president destroyed the country, and particularly Dick Cheney working from the shadows. In terms of not liking it, as someone who loves politics myself, it's a bit too in the middle of what I want and just being educational. So for example, The Big Short is good because it knows its subject matter is so complicated, nearly everyone watching this film won't understand it. But Vice isn't as good because it talks about people that a lot of people know and political junkies know, but then it doesn't do enough to explain things to people who don't. So for example, Roger Ailes ran Fox News for years, right? He's basically the creator of Fox News. So it talks about Roger Ailes in the 60s and where he started. Name dropping Roger Ailes for someone like me is fine, right? But it doesn't explain really who he is, and it doesn't give me any more insight. So them telling you who Roger Ailes is pretty irrelevant, because they'll say about one sentence. And for me, it does nothing because I know who Roger Ailes is. If you want to do something interesting, tell me something I didn't know about him in the 60s. And that's where I think the film kind of loses a lot of, its appeal. And also, I don't really like the time jumping. It goes back and forth way too much, and I'm not really a big fan of it. But I'd say go see the film if you like politics, if you like Christian Bale, if you like this style of maybe more comedic take on serious issues, something like Michael Moore and something like The Big Short. I think it's worth a watch. But there's lots of things I didn't like about it, and The Big Short is a lot of a stronger movie in my opinion.
So what do you think the overriding message is?
Yeah, so I've talked a lot about what the politics of it is. So I think the message is, I think it's just holding our leaders to, maybe hold them up to more scrutiny than they really have done, and not really worshipping the presidency, because they get you into all these situations and really just don't trust the powerful people in this country, and especially Republicans in this country. I don't know why I always say that, but I'm not American, I'm British, but I kind of always say this country. But I just think it's exposing how bad this time was, and it's trying to make you realise America essentially never really does things for its own. Never really does things for the world's interest. It's always its own interest, and they'll dress it up and they'll lie and do all these things. But I think the film's very good at exposing how corrupt they are and how much they don't care about a lot of other people apart from themselves. And I'd say it's more about an education on the Iraq War and Dick Cheney, rather than saying something overarching about capitalism or our political systems in the US and the UK. But it's just good at reminding you how angry you are about things like that, and I think it's worth watching for anyone in that regard. So that's.
Is it easier to follow than The Big Short?
No, because it jumps all over the place. Where Big Short is a chronological story.
Big Short is so complicated.
But I think it was okay explaining it in general.
I had to write a review for it, and I had to Google the entire plot after I watched it, because I couldn't understand.
Well, it's about is it CBDs and everything, like these junk bonds that people are sold in houses. It is a complicated thing, even for people who like economics.
It's like placing bets on the collapse of markets and stuff.
Well, that's what the main characters in The Big Short do, whereas everyone else doesn't believe it's going to collapse.
Yeah.
But that's good at making you angry, because it tells you at the end that no one who created this financial crisis and the housing crisis, no one went to jail.
Yeah.
And I think this is good as well, because it just reminds you the guy who was the architect was behind 2 wars and all these things in the Bush presidency never paid the price. And that's actually ironic. At the end, he gets a heart transplant, and that is one good point in the film. Jesse Plemons, who you know from Fargo, plays Kirsten Dunst's husband. He narrates most of the film, and then some spoiler here, he gets hit by a car, and he's actually the guy who donates his heart to Dick Cheney, because Dick Cheney needs a heart transplant.
Oh, really?
And it's quite an interesting thing, just to be like, this guy was so close to dying, he probably deserved it, but then this kid got hit by a car and he had to give up his heart to Dick Cheney, and then so it's quite an interesting little dynamic it has there.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's pretty much everything I want to say about that. So for your second film, you've put in Eye in the Sky, and I assume that nearly everyone watching this hasn't actually seen this film. And it's Alan Rickman's last film he ever did, so maybe some people have seen it. So would you like to explain to everyone what the premise of Eye in the Sky is?
Yeah, so I think it's a really... I wouldn't say it's underrated, because I don't even know if a lot of people have seen it. I think it kind of got a little bit buried at the cinema because the Jungle Book was out at the same time.
Oh, okay.
And I just went to see it kind of by chance because I had to review it. I wouldn't really have gone to see it otherwise. But I remember just like bawling my eyes out at the end of it, because it's such a powerful film. It's basically about drone strikes, and is it set in Somalia?
I think it's set in Kenya.
Oh, okay.
But near the border, I forgot what country. I got a map here, so keep talking for a second. Kenya and Somalia are on the same border. Yeah,
okay.
So there we go.
So it's in Kenya.
I think it's on the border of Kenya and Somalia.
Yeah. So it's about drone strikes basically, and Helen Mirren is sort of like the commander it's set on one day when they're making a strike against this terrorist group. And
the Somali guy from Captain Phillips, Blade Runner, it plays the guy on the ground.
We should know his name.
Yeah.
Abdul
something. I'll look it up.
Yeah,
while we talk.
Because he's really good. What's the terrorist group called?
Well, it's probably Al-Shabaab. It might be Al-Shabaab.
Yeah, it's Al-Shabaab. Sorry. Yeah. So basically, it's set in one day, and they are trying to target them when they meet in this house because they're planning an attack, basically.
So his name is
Barkhad Abdi.
Yeah.
Oh, Abdul.
So yeah, keep going.
I did know that. So he is basically, that actor plays a guy on the ground
who helps the British out.
Yeah, and they're basically trying to make this drone strike throughout one day, and it really is a really good insight into seeing how the thought process and the moral decisions that go into making a drone strike, especially when civilians are involved, and the sort of like one of the main characters in it is the little girl selling bread, and she's very close to the proximity of where the strike is going to be.
So essentially the premise is over one day it just follows, you know, a process of should the British government conduct a drone strike in Kenya?
It's the US government.
No, right? It's the British government.
Really?
It's Alan Rickman and Helen Mirren playing British people.
Oh yeah, no, but Jesse, what's his name from Breaking Bad, is one of the guys.
Oh, I completely forgot about that. That's the drone operator, but
the decision making is British. Yeah.
But so yeah, that's the premise. It's a drone going overhead, and you're always, you know, from a drone's point of view, and it just takes place over one day. So people getting the gist of this. And why do you particularly like this film, or do you have any criticisms or anything like that?
Yeah, so I really liked it because the tension it creates throughout the whole thing is unbearable. It's so high tension for the entire thing, because there's so many moments when you think they're going to make the strike and then something happens and then it changes the whole decision making process, and they have to go through so many people, you know, that they're trying to call the Prime Minister, and it's just a really good insight into it. But the reason it kind of really stuck with me is because obviously it gives such attention to the civilian aspect of it, and it gives real attention to this girl and her family, so that it matters that she might be injured in it, basically.
But it's
I
kind
could
of
spoil what happens.
Yeah, but I guess it's kind of asking the question, what is it worth to save? You know, it's based on, the film gives you a good insight into someone like a little girl, but it's like, do you save a little girl or do you not? And then other people might die instead.
It's like, do you kill these terrorists to prevent a massive terrorist attack and sacrifice the life of one girl, or, you know, do you not interfere and let it happen, but you have not killed a civilian? But yeah, there's moments where they're about to strike, and then you basically see the impact zone, and there's like a death zone, and there's people that are slightly too far into it, and yeah, it's just really, really emotional, and I'd really recommend it, because like I said, I don't think a lot of people saw it when it came out. But it's it's really good insight and makes you think a lot.
Now, because this film has a lot of different perspectives, you know, you have some British generals, you have an American pilot, you have someone on the ground working for the British government to help them conduct this strike and spy on the terrorists. What do you think the actual message of the film is? Because there's obviously a lot of attention on drones since like Obama started using them and Donald Trump. But what do you think the overall message about drones is? Because I don't think it's very clear cut, and I don't think you could necessarily say it's completely anti-drone in its depiction of how a drone strike is conducted.
Yeah, it's good because there's obviously like a lot of nuance to it. It's not preachy in that it would leave you with, look at what happened, drones are terrible, because you see, what's his name, Jesse
from Breaking Bad.
Yeah, the guy from Breaking Bad. He is the guy. Aaron Paul. Yeah. Jesse, that's his character's name, isn't it? I haven't even watched Breaking Bad. He's basically controlling the drone with like the joystick, and
he's the one who has to fire.
He has to he presses the button basically, and it's like the classic question of, you know, who is the murderer? Is it the person who gives the orders? Is it the one who pulls the trigger? I feel like it leaves you with the message, sometimes difficult decisions have to be made and civilians are injured or killed, but in the grand scheme of things, you know, it's to prevent terrorism, or it's to wipe out, you know, central people within these terrorist groups. But it does leave you with a very, very heavy moral feeling of, is it still okay, you know, to interfere and kill innocent civilians? Because it's kind of easy to say, oh, well, in the grand scheme of things, look at all these people that didn't die because of it. But, you know, if that was your child, then how, like, you would just be completely disillusioned with the government.
That's how terrorism's created. And, you know, who's going to find out about a poor black African girl being killed by a drone strike that kills maybe like 3 or 4 terrorists? No one's going to know about that. And we found out that they've actually been covering it up lately, whether it's Obama or Trump. They haven't actually been listing the amount of civilians they've been killing in places like Afghanistan, so no one ever knows about them. It's just another number, and a lot of the time they actually list the civilian casualties under terrorists killed. So
yeah, and it's like, even in the news, when there's a terrorist attack in maybe an African country or somewhere in Asia, people just don't care as much.
There was one in Pakistan recently, I think 30 people died.
And even like, you know, mosque bombings where 300 plus people die, it does not linger long in the news, and that's when they are victims of terrorism. But when someone's a victim of a government attack, no way is that going to get reported, and it's really, really tragic and sad. So it's a good film for showing
I don't think the film's general message is that, you know, people care about white lives more, even though I think that is something that's true. Like the media, the New Zealand attack, that's massive coverage. A Shia mosque getting bombed in Afghanistan, killing hundreds of people, no one really cares. Like, I think, you know, a mosque gets shot up in a Christian white country and everyone cares. A mosque gets blown up in the Middle East, no one cares. I think that's not the point of the film, but I think it's, you know, maybe a point that the film could touch on, maybe a bit better, because you know, people do die, civilians do die, and I don't think it's really touched on. But I think one thing I don't like about it, in a way a lot of Western films are, it's more about the guilt of people who are doing this, and I don't really like that. It's like Platoon as well. It's sort of erases. This film's a bit better because there are characters who are native to that country, but something like Platoon, it sort of erases the natives in the story. They're kind of faceless people, and a lot of films on the war on terror, whether that's American Sniper or The Hurt Locker, the Arabs and the Muslims are depicted in quite either apathetic ways to what's going on, like meaning they don't care about the terrorism, or they are all evil terrorists. So I think the film is better in that regard, but I still don't really like so much having all the perspectives, because, you know, who do you come out feeling the most sorry for in this film? Maybe someone like Aaron Paul, but he signed on to do that, and he's part of the group that are doing it, and you feel bad for him, but I don't think that's always a great thing to put in a film, because that's the takeaway. You know, an actor we like is struggling with doing a drone strike.
Yeah,
Should we really feel bad for someone who voluntarily does that?
Yeah, the one thing I will say is, you know, you see his personal moral struggle with it during, like, when he's getting the orders and stuff, and then it's when they leave the sort of like cabin thing that they're sitting
just
in,
leave, like
and,
they've been playing a video
it's
game
like the end. It's like the end of a work day, and they walk out, and something like thousands of miles away they've made happen, and that's really like morally difficult to comprehend as well.
I think that sort of shows the detachment a lot of these people can do.
Yeah.
When they never have to really, you know, deal with their actions in a personal way, unlike people in the military.
And you know, there's the bit where they call the Prime Minister, and he's got the diarrhea, and he's on the toilet, and you know,
it's the Foreign Secretary, I think, in that one.
Oh right, yeah, and like he's having to make a decision, and it's just kind of like he is so detached. But what I was gonna say was the final shot of the film is that girl hula hooping, and it's very like emotive, like camera work and music, and I think is making a very strong point that they want the final message of the film to be her. Yeah. You know, so I even though you do feel sorry for the characters, I think you are thinking more about
it's quite balanced, if nothing else.
So next is a show you've been telling me to watch for ages. Man in the High Castle.
Yeah, so Man in the High Castle was a book written by Philip K. Dick, who's really the father of modern sci-fi. So Philip K. Dick wrote the book that inspired Blade Runner, Minority Report, Total Recall, and Man in the High Castle, included various other things as well. But basically, Man in the High Castle takes place in the 1960s in America that has been occupied by both the Japanese Empire and the Nazi Reich. So, you know, obviously the Allies have lost World War II in this, and you follow a couple different characters. So one character, the main character, is called Juliana Crane, who's grown up in Japanese-occupied LA, and she kind of likes the culture. She goes to martial arts with Japanese people. They ask her out on dates and everything. And the first episode's kind of interesting in getting this perspective, because you have someone like Juliana who kind of likes, you know, all this stuff, because it's all she's really known, because when she was a kid it was invaded, and you have a little flashback. She's about 5 or 6 years old when the Japanese arrive. But it's an interesting perspective to start the show, rather than someone who's been, you know, fighting the Nazis or the Japanese for years. But then you have lots of other characters. So you have Captain John Smith, who is played by Rufus Sewell, who is the bad guy in A Knight's Tale. That's the only thing I know him from. And he actually went to school locally. He went to school in Twickenham and everything. So he's from around here, and he's an ex-American soldier essentially, who's become one of the top people in the SS in the US, and he's one of the main characters. But he starts off as a traditional villain until you get an insight into like his family and everything. So he's another character you see the perspective of. And there's a Japanese trade minister who's kind of nice. That's the good thing about the show. I know I'm stretching into the next point a bit, but I just want to set up the premise. The good bit about the show is all these perspectives are from a world that exists, rather than this Nazi's bad, this Japanese person's bad, and this resistance fighter is good. It's like loads of shades of grey. And then you have a couple other characters, like a traditional American person, and then a really brutal Japanese head of intelligence. But it's 3 seasons now, going into its last season, the end of the year. And the premise is basically these people all have found newsreels of footage of the Allies winning the war. And it's sort of getting into the mystery around that. You know, how can this exist? And it's actually footage of the war from our world, basically. And how does this exist? And there is a lot of sci-fi to it, and yeah, that's the basic premise of the show, and I would really recommend it. It's really thought-provoking and interesting.
So what do you like and dislike about it?
So like I've already said, I like the perspectives of all the different characters, because you always hate and like someone at different points in the show. So I was talking about John Smith, who's the Nazi captain, and then the head of the Japanese intelligence in LA is called Kido, Inspector Kido. And they do some like unforgivable things when you first meet them, like totally unforgivable. You'd think you'd always hate them, but then they have some quite redeeming qualities, because they exist in a world that is so brutal. So like, for example, Hitler is a character in this show, Himmler is a character in this show, you have the Emperor Hirohito's son and everything.
Who plays Hitler?
I don't think it's anyone famous, but he looks really like him. He's not in it too much, but then it's these people struggling with what they've done. So Captain John Smith, while you see him kill Jews, while you see him interrogate people and torture people, one of his friends reference him, you know, at the start of the occupation of America, basically killing Jews and stuff, and he feels awful about it, like he couldn't deal with it for years, and you feel bad for him. I mean, you find out more about his backstory, which I won't spoil, but it makes you sympathise with him even more and hate him even more. And then someone like the trade minister, who's really interesting, he's just such a nice guy, but he works for the Japanese government, but you sort of realise a lot of these people, it's just, for the Japanese especially, it's just like the British Empire, they just are nice people maybe living in another country and occupying it. And the sort of racial dynamics is interesting as well. So the Third Reich is all white people. So the east coast of America is occupied by the Nazis, and it's all just white people, whereas the Japanese is a mixture, and they haven't banned religion either, where the Nazis have banned all religion. So you can be, for example, black people have it a bit better in the Japanese zone, and so do a lot of other people. But they sort of have an agreement with the Nazis to enforce these policies of racial purity, which they don't, because it's just a bit different. And then in the middle of this is something called the neutral zone, where everyone goes to sort of just live on their own if they want to live outside these two countries, which is an interesting place. It's got a mixture of like gangs and Nazi secret agents and Japanese secret agents all working together. And it's just a cool thing. It's just like a Cold War between Japan and Nazi Germany. And like I said, it's not so much about overthrowing these regimes, it's just about the world that exists. And I don't really have too many bad things to say about it, to be honest. I think it's really well done, nice high budget. I'd say Juliana, the main character, I don't know, she can get a bit annoying, but I'd say that's about it. And there's a lot of other good characters I haven't talked about. And just the way it deals with a lot of issues today, like there's a scene in the third season where the Hitler Youth are running riot in New York with like tiki torches, talking about Jews not replacing them. It's obviously a reference to the Charlottesville rally, but it's just seeing how this doesn't look out of place at all in an America controlled by the Nazis, just showing how bad this stuff is recently. And yeah, it's just, in my opinion, really good show, like top tier acting and top tier the production value, and just great characters that you just feel so mixed towards all the time. And I can't really say anything bad about it, to be honest. Nothing springs to mind. It's all just really good stuff.
And what do you think the overarching message of the show is? So
I think the message of the show, a lot of it has to do with the resistance and how just not to give up in the face of all these odds. And a lot of groups carve out not an existence for themselves away from the Nazis. And I think it's one of a lot of ways of identity and not letting groups destroy your identity like the Japanese and the Nazis try and do in this show. And I think it's become super relevant because of the rise of fascism, or the renewed rise of fascism in the world, in America or in Western Europe and in the UK to some extent as well. And it's just talking about standing up to these groups and what you got to do, because what the best thing this show does for me is make me so grateful for the people who fought in World War II, because the world these guys live in is so awful and brutal. And when they see the films of the Allies winning the war, it's just like so weird to them, because they can't imagine a world that exists. So I think the message is, you've got to stand up to fascism in the first place and call it out, and at the same time it's just talking about how grateful you should be to the people who did fight against it, because the world would be so messed up if these two groups, well, I don't think the Japanese as much, because they're just a traditional empire with a bit more fanaticism to them, because it's obviously like religiously motivated, because they think the emperor is their god. But the Nazis in particular is just super brutal, and it shows how all this horrible science and ethnic cleansing could have just really become super dominant. So I think it's just a warning against all that stuff. And Philip K. Dick was a massive anti-fascist. That's what the purpose of a lot of his books were. So it's good that they've carried on that message, and his daughter is actually working on the show to make sure they carry across his message.
What do you think about people who don't feel that way towards veterans and people who fought in the war, don't feel grateful towards what they did because they're pacifists or anti-war or whatever? Do you think that it's something people could watch and change?
Yeah, well, I think World War II is somewhere where you can be pretty uncynical in a lot of ways, but it doesn't mean everyone was great. So, for example, George Bush Sr. fought in World War II, Bob Dole fought in World War II. They're both Republican people, they're awful politicians. I don't think you have to be super grateful for the military, but I think there's an element of this generation that they sacrificed so much for the good of all of us, especially the ones who fought the Nazis, and you've got to be pretty grateful for that. But there's a lot of horrible things. I think history is quite nuanced. For example, the Soviets, 20 million Russians died in World War II, but Russians actually carried out mass rapes of a lot of people. So when they fought the Japanese in Mongolia, they actually raped thousands and thousands of Mongolian civilians who had nothing to do with it. So history is very nuanced, and a lot of Americans committed war crimes. The way they treated black soldiers. I made a video in the past about white American soldiers trying to bring Jim Crow to Britain during the war and stuff. So it's nuanced, but at the same time, a lot of these people just stood up to fascism and face odds in like an unimaginable way. You know, we've watched The Pacific and Half a Band of Brothers, and you just can't believe people would go into these wars, especially maybe Americans specifically, going to a war in a place that doesn't directly affect them in Europe and fighting these overwhelming odds. And it's just so horrific, you can't even imagine it today and imagine having to do that. So you've got to be grateful in a lot of regards. But I obviously share a lot of the skepticism in general with people. You know, I'm not a massive fan of the military or soldiers or anything. I don't think you should worship them. But I think World War II is maybe one exception, and World War One being sort of another. But you know, you just feel bad people got made to fight in that rather than thinking they're heroes. So up next, Hollie has put down Leaving Neverland, which is the recent documentary series about the abuses of Michael Jackson. And Michael Jackson's, you know, someone everyone likes, someone who I like as well. Not a massive fan, but I like a lot of his music. And, you know, our parents obviously were massive fans because they grew up at the exact time he rose to prominence and everything, and sort of similar ages and everything. So, you know, what is the premise of this documentary and what exactly is it exposing, and, you know, from whose perspective is it really listening to and everything?
Yeah, so I think if you haven't seen Leaving Neverland, I think it's something everyone should watch. It's basically about two boys that are now grown men that were friends with Michael Jackson when they were younger. He helped them with their careers, they were dancers, and it's basically about the relationship they had with him and the sexual abuse that they were subject to. So you know, the opening line that one of them says is, you know, he was the most supported, loving, kind-hearted man I ever met, but he also sexually abused me. And you know, as well as it kind of giving everyone this new perspective of Michael Jackson, even though everyone was well aware that he did this anyway, it kind of shows you the reality of grooming and sexual assault and paedophilia, because it's not always violent or forceful, because these boys were absolutely besotted with Michael Jackson when they were younger. They really loved him, and it just shows someone taking advantage of two boys that were really loved him. So obviously I'm not going to ask you why you like this, because it's obviously pretty horrible, but what do you like about the style of the documentary or the things it talks about? And why do you think this is important, what they're talking about? Yeah, so there's a lot of positive feelings from the boys in the documentary. Sorry, they're grown men now, but you know, you're kind of hearing their stories that as if they were boys, because that's when it happened. But they describe it like a consensual relationship rather than someone preying on them. Exactly, and I've never come across a story like that before, and I've never thought about paedophilia before like that. I've never thought about sexual assault like that, because it was weirdly consensual, but the abuse started at an age when they were obviously far too young to consent, but it continued when they were of age and they knew what was happening, and they still wanted to do it, but obviously it had absolutely awful effects, and they talk about the mental effects it had on them, and you know, he helped both of their careers massively. And what going back to your question, what I really liked about it was that you see the perspective of the families, and they talk about, you know, going to visit, and you know, he'd call the house and he'd visit them, and he'd almost groom the families too. Exactly. And it's almost like there's a big Netflix documentary at the moment called Abducted in Plain Sight, and people are absolutely like shocked that this family was so complicit in allowing this girl who was groomed by this guy. The family basically, like you said, were groomed as well, and you basically see that families are can very much be involved in, and you know, there's the conversation of why did the parents let these children sleep with Michael Jackson, and then, you know, but you got to ask yourself, like, it's Michael Jackson, like, why would you say no to him, you know? And I think anyone could be in that situation. So it's a really powerful documentary, because there is so much honesty from the guys talking about how much they loved him, what it meant to them to be like that special to Michael Jackson. And one of them talks about, you know, Macaulay Culkin and another boy coming into the picture and how heartbroken he was, because it was literally like a grown-up relationship for them.
So he'd sort of like, when they get old enough, he'd choose someone else, like a younger version of them.
Yeah, exactly.
So obviously the film is really targeting, you know, Michael Jackson specifically, but do you think there's a broader point it's trying to make about holding, you know, people to account who are very powerful, or, you know, people's art that you like and everything? Do you think it's trying to make a broader point, or do you think just because it's dealing with this subject matter, you sort of come away with that anyway, regardless of the film having an agenda for this sort of topic?
Yeah, like, I think the thing that was really challenging for people about this was, obviously Michael Jackson's been on trial for this before and he got away with it, and now it's kind of so damning and he's dead, so he can't really be punished for it. But you know, there was protests in London against the airing of this documentary because people were so hurt by the fact that their absolute idol was going to be portrayed in this way. And it's challenging for people, and it's difficult when someone you're a fan of, you know, cancel culture, you suddenly just have to reject and just see them in a completely different light. Everyone loves Michael Jackson, and I think even after this his music is still going to be iconic. And I
doubt they're going to stop showing Thriller up London.
Exactly. And you know, certain radio stations have banned his music, but you know, at parties and stuff, if Thriller comes on, if Billie Jean comes on, no one is going to boycott his music.
It's a hard one, because John Lennon treated his first wife awfully, like beat her all the time and stuff. Elvis Presley was not a nice person as well. So it's kind of hard, you know, when do you separate the art from the artist? I think it's different with music as well, because it's your choice to listen to it in you know, privacy, and it's just one person often singing, so you can't detach it, you know, one person who's just singing to you, I guess, in this moment. Whereas someone like Kevin Spacey, you're watching his performance on a show with lots of other people, so you can kind of separate Kevin Spacey from this, because it's not just about Kevin Spacey, I mean, it's about the whole cast. Kevin Spacey
is a really good example, because American Beauty is one of my favourite films, and all of a sudden, if you have good morals, you kind of do have to just reject this person. If you are a good person, you will believe the victims, and you will accept, you know, Kevin Spacey did this awful thing. And it's hard to hear, and it is disappointing when someone you're such a fan of suddenly news comes out that they have done this, and it almost takes more strength to reject them. And that was the big thing with leaving Neverland, basically. And yeah, like you said, it does create sort of a wider conversation about people in positions of power. We saw it with Harvey Weinstein, obviously, all these people who were in positions where their careers could be advanced, and obviously that's very like one-sided view of like explaining that situation.
It's a broader point. Like, everyone knows Donald Trump, Bill Clinton, Kevin Spacey, Bryan Singer. Everyone knows these guys are dirty, and whether that's sex abuse or sexual assault, we all know it, and we're letting them get away with it as a society. And Joe Biden, I think, is the latest example where you can see it happen in real time, where people are defending, essentially, in my eyes, a sexual predator who's using his power to get away with groping underage girls and even women a lot of the time, and he's using his power to get away with it. And you know, an excuse for him saying that's just the way he is, who doesn't understand that's, you know, the height of privilege. He's literally getting away with things that would get most people fired from a job. And I think, you know, that it's a good thing to bring up in this era of just holding people to account and everything, which I haven't seen the documentary yet, but I hope, you know, from what you're saying, it sounds like that's the message and everything.
Yeah, and it's kind of it's going to be sort of iconic. Don't know if that's really the right word for what it is, but especially when you watch it and you see two completely different people describe almost identical experiences, and you know, if this is all a big ruse because their career is going downhill or whatever, it's the most elaborate lie and money-making scheme that has ever existed.
They have good careers, and this could only hurt their careers by coming forward with this stuff. So that's another point against the people saying they just want fame and money and everything. Yeah,
but ultimately, like I said, it's a really, really good watch in terms of making you see paedophilia and sexual assault in a different way. And you know, there's one quite graphic description where one of the guys talks about how Michael Jackson tried to finally use penetration and he didn't like it and he stopped. And in a weird way, people might be like, oh, that's very considerate. But in the context, it's like, you know, it's this weird manipulation that you're still sexually abusing someone. You're just doing it in a less forceful way, in a way that gives them a bit of control in the situation.
Even in Michael Jackson's mind, if it was a relationship, it's still the power dynamic, because of the age and because of, you know, who he is still wrong. Even if Michael Jackson thought in his head, this is consensual, this is just a relationship, rather than everyone else can see it for what it is. It's basically, you know, being a sexual predator, grooming kids and shit like that. So yeah, so I think it's an interesting thing it brings to light of how Michael Jackson got away with it for so long, and how he shut these people up because they loved him so much, rather than, you know, the traditional story of abuse where someone just preys on someone for years, like in like a nightmarish way. It's more like, you know, like grooming and everything. But yeah, I think it's interesting. Obviously, you need to finish it, and I need to start it and everything. But I think it's something everyone should check out.
So moving on to the next TV show that you've watched, Assassination of Versace.
So yeah, Assassination of Gianni Versace is the second series of American crime stories. So the first one was The People vs. O.J. Simpson, which, you know, won a lot of awards. Everyone really likes it. I know you like it as well. And it's directed by Ryan Murphy, who is famous for Glee, but he's also famous for now American Horror Story and American Crime Story, and he's a gay man himself. And if people don't know, which I'm sure you do know the brand, Versace, or Gianni Versace, was a fashion designer who was assassinated outside his home in, I think it's Venice Beach in Miami, by a young serial killer called Andrew Cunanan, who was also gay. And Andrew Cunanan also killed a lot of other gay people. And that's the premise of the film. It basically starts with Versace's death and goes backwards, where you see, you know, the backstories of both Versace and Andrew Cunanan. And it's basically, instead of focusing so much on Versace, even though it does, it's mainly about Andrew, the serial killer. And it's really interesting, and just, you know, following this guy. And Darren Criss plays Andrew, and Edgar Ramirez plays Versace. And it's just an interesting story to see their dynamic and see the interactions they have, and just see the gay community in the late 1990s, because that's when this is set, between, I think it's 1989 and 1997. And it's just great performances from Edgar Ramirez, Darren Criss, and Penelope Cruz, who plays, what's her name? You know her, the sister? Donatella Versace. So it's all just really good stuff there.
Okay, so what do you like about it?
So yeah, I really like the style of the whole thing, and I really like the music and everything. It's very 80s inspired. And the acting is insanely good, just like American Crime Story Season 1, where you see, you know, all these people seem very similar to the real life versions. So Edgar Ramirez looks exactly like Gianni Versace. Andrew Cunanan, Darren Criss is actually half Filipino, half Italian, just like the actual serial killer. And then you have, obviously, Penelope Cruz is really, really good as Donatella. And I've watched her interviews saying that she knows Donatella personally. And Penelope Cruz is, I think she's Spanish, but she's doing obviously an Italian accent, but she's really good as well. And I like the order it does it. So I took a massive break from watching this, and the last half of the season goes further and further back to Andrew's backstory. So when I'd finished the show, I just felt bad for him, because I'd only watched, you know, what he'd been through to make him a serial killer. It's such an amazing performance from Darren Criss, who won all the awards for this. Just how much of a compulsive liar he is, and just how crazy he gets, but he's just not the type of person you would think would become a serial killer. Like, he went to prep school, he's really well spoken, he's really flamboyant and everything, he's really, you know, charming as a character, and it's just an interest to see his fall. But overall, it's just super entertaining. It's nice and stylized as well, and it just really gives a good glimpse into the culture of the late 90s, which, because me and you were born 1995, we kind of think we know 90s history and everything, and we know 90s culture, but it is very, very different from what you would imagine. And, you know, the performance is just so good. I'd probably rate it a bit higher than O.J. Simpson, which is a courtroom drama, but which is very good as well. But this is just more action and just a more interesting perspective on the killer. Whereas I think the O.J. one is interesting, but it's more about everyone else, whereas this is very focused on Andrew himself.
So what do you think the messages of it are?
So because Ryan Murphy is gay, I think it's trying to show us how bad gay people had it, even as late as, you know, 1997, and the hysteria that Andrew Cunanan brought from the gay community. You know, he's a gay man killing other gay men and killing Versace, and, you know, people who were around at the time saying it was just, people were so hysterical already about AIDS and gay people, and now they were more hysterical about, you know, murderous people with AIDS coming after them and just like destroying the community. And I think he's trying to point out the stigma. And what is really interesting, there's a lot of characters like policemen who talk to, you know, they interview Versace's boyfriend after Versace's murdered, and they're just sort of just saying, you know, what are you to him? And they don't really understand the dynamics of their relationship. And then at Versace's funeral, you know, his boyfriend is essentially snubbed and everything. They treat him like he doesn't exist, and just the implicit stigma that a lot of characters in the show have against gay people is really interesting. I think the broader point of it is trying to show, you know, how gay people were treated in this way. But also, what I really like about the show is you see how, you know, nice a person Versace was. And, you know, you probably wouldn't expect it from a billionaire fashion designer, but him and his sister's relationship is really nice, and it makes you feel really bad for her, and she still seems to be really affected by it when she was asked about it lately after the show came out. But I think it's a really nice thing. It's trying to, you know, show what Andrew Cunanan was like and what created him. And there's a really good line someone says is like, you know, Andrew's not hiding from you. You know, he wants to be heard because he's so angry. You know, he sort of hates himself in a way because of the way society treats him. And it's a really interesting point that Ryan Murphy's trying to get across. And just, you know, I think that's a general message. It's just really trying to show people it wasn't that long ago. You know, when we were, you know, babies and stuff, gay people were still treated really bad, and there was such a hysteria about AIDS. And, you know, that's why it's a really big deal. Like Princess Diana, you know, touched a person with AIDS and stuff on camera. And, you know, Diana's one of the people who actually goes to Versace's funeral. So, you know, that's why, you know, Diana was such a good person for the royal family and everything, just challenging all these you know, hysterical things people felt about gay people in general. And, you know, she was obviously friends with Elton John and everything. But yeah, I just really like the themes of the show, just dealing with this type of stuff. And overall, I think everyone should watch it. Just, it's really entertaining, but has a good message as well. And, you know, Ryan Murphy, I'm looking forward to his take on his next shows are going to be about Hurricane Katrina and Bill Clinton's impeachment. So I think that's going to be really interesting and deal with this climate in those times. And I think the Bill Clinton one will be really interesting after Me Too. You know, what will he be saying about someone like Bill Clinton abusing his power on Monica Lewinsky? So I think that would be a really interesting series to watch. So that concludes the first podcast. I hope you all liked it, and, you know, let me know what you think in the comments. Give me some feedback. What would make this show better? What would you like us to talk about? It won't always be Hollie here, although, you know, if you really liked Hollie, just say in the comments as well if you want her back as a reoccurring guest. I'm going to try and get different people on so we can talk about different things. So, for example, me and Hollie really love films and TV shows, so that's what we spoke about. But I have other friends that like different things, so I'd happily talk about other things. So leave that in the comments. So, Hollie, if, you know, people want to keep up to date with you on social media, where should they find you?
So I'm at Hollie_Garrity on Twitter, and I'm Hollie Garrity on Instagram.
Okay, so, you know, people who watch me regularly might already know this, but, you know, follow me at the Kavernacle on both Twitter and Instagram. Check out my WordPress, where I have reviewed a couple of these films that we spoke about, and that's just the Kavernacle WordPress. And yeah, so let me know what you think about this podcast. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and if you made it this far, thank you for watching.